An interesting aspect of the Zelda cycle is that without fail, with every new Zelda release, the last one is suddenly a masterpiece, right? We spent the past 6 years people trying to tell us that Breath of the Wild wasn't that great, that it wasn't that big of a deal, that it didn't revolutionize open world games, that it didn't redefine the Zelda formula, that it wasn't one of the best games ever made. We went through this process with Breath of the Wild, right? Where everyone said the game was terrible and that it wouldn't live up to the legacy of the iconic franchise. And now that Tears of the Kingdom is out, the same thing is happening again. Tears of the Kingdom is being attacked by special interest groups and people who are looking to downplay Nintendo and the Zelda IP, while Breath of the Wild, in order to take down Tears of the Kingdom, is venerated as a result. Now, the reason this happens is that Pretendos don't really see older games as a threat. It's fine to like older Nintendo games. When it comes to the stuff that just came out, stuff like Detective Pikachu Returns, stuff like Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, stuff like WarioWare Move It, Super Mario RPG, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, Fire Emblem Engage, Bayonetta 3, Cereza and the Lost Demon, Advance Wars 1 and 2 Remake. Like, all of these games need to be attacked to a certain extent. They need to keep the narrative going that Nintendo is behind the times and that the real gaming uh, the re- the real evolution in gaming is on other platforms, right? PlayStation, Xbox, and PC, right? That has always been the narrative, right? If you want to play the real games for adults, you have to play it on another platform. And Nintendo used to be good, but it isn't anymore. So you have to move on. You have to grow up and move on to another platform. That's always been the narrative. I saw this happen with, Ocarina of Time, with Majora's Mask, with Wind Waker, with Twilight Princess, with Skyward Sword. Like, it is a reality of the Zelda cycle, right? In order to take down the newest, excellent, grade A masterpiece in the Zelda franchise, the Pretendos have to hype up the previous one. And that is what we're seeing now with Tears of the Kingdom. We are seeing a lot of people begin to admit that Breath of the Wild is an amazing game, which is very exciting to see because this is something I've been fighting for years and years. I remember fighting with people like back when Horizon was the big thing that people were trying to sell you on as being like the better Zelda, right? Like, I remember people trying to say that like Horizon was more technically impressive and that it looked better and that it had a way better plot and gameplay, which isn't true at all. I've played Horizon Mini Yawns in the years since, and I can tell you that for certain. And in the end, what happened? By 2018, Horizon was completely forgotten. Nobody talked about it anymore. By the time the sequel came out, nobody cared at all. It did significantly worse than the original game. And when Tears of the Kingdom came out, it was a monumental success, which built on what Breath of the Wild did and did something new, interesting, and innovative, right? And now we're seeing like Pretendos try and like throw dozens of different games at Tears of the Kingdom, right? The big argument we're seeing right now is that it isn't talked about enough. But in reality, these guys are like making so many threads, like shit talking Tears of the Kingdom, that narrative doesn't even hold up anymore. Like, at any point in time, you can go on 4chan and see someone trying to make a thread about Tears of the Kingdom. Oh, why does no one talk about the game anymore? Hey, genius, you're talking about the game right now, okay? The game is more talked about than like Baldur's Gate 3, right? The game is more talked about than the games that you say are more talked about than Tears of the Kingdom, right? Like, what exactly metric are you going by here? Right? And that's the issue, is that it feels as if like the old like standbys when it came to like downplaying Nintendo games, sales and critic scores no longer apply to Zelda. Zelda has found a formula that both sells well and does well with critics. So well that even something like massively inflated, like Baldur's Gate 3, can't compete with it, right? So, like, Zelda just stomps that into the ground. It outperforms it critically and commercially, and will be remembered for a much longer stretch of time. What exactly How exactly do you combat that? And I think that's what the Pretendos are desperately trying to do, right? That's why you see them constantly bringing up like the whole it's a DLC argument, and seeing them try and go after like going after other Nintendo games and like pretending the Switch is on the verge of being replaced and that the Switch will never outsell the PS2. I remember last year how that was a big like talking point, how the Switch would be like replaced by 2023 and as a result would in no way outsell the PS2. But here we are in 2023 with no Switch successor in sight and it's becoming obvious to everyone that the Switch will 100% outsell PS2 in the next 2 years. And right now we're in this phase where like nobody wants to acknowledge that at all. Nobody wants to acknowledge what that means. In that like Nintendo has outperformed the PS2, which was incorrectly labeled as the best-selling platform of all time, right? Nobody wants to admit that Sony has failed in their endeavors to destroy Nintendo and acquire their IPs and like just dismantle the entire brand and just monopolize the entire console industry. Like nobody wants to acknowledge that, you know. Nobody wants to admit that Nintendo won the console war, even at this stage. Like they're still trying to convince you they're gonna lose. It's weird. These guys are gonna like keep doing this until they drop. It feels like, right? It's a lot like how Michael Pachter kept like predicting that Nintendo would fail, you know, through like all through the Wii years up until like the release of the Wii U and the 3DS and like nobody took him seriously, right? Like I'm told even now he's still doing his thing, but nobody cares anymore. The guy made himself a joke, right? It's the same thing with like these Zelda cycle people, right? It's the same thing with these with these kind of like analysts and YouTubers, right? Like with these with these Twitter users, like by what metric is Tears of the Kingdom not a success? Because nobody has been able to explain to me how the game isn't better than Baldur's Gate 3, right? All anybody can do is just rely on superficial commentary like, oh, it's not talked about enough. Oh, it's not innovative enough. Oh, it's an expansion, not a real game. Like they're just finding excuses. Like when you actually compare the two, it's obvious that Zelda is better. With its more original quest lines, with its better mechanics, with its more intense action, with its better boss fights, like with its less degeneracy, right? The reason Zelda like are is better than Baldur's Gate 3 just keeps piling up as you play Zelda, right? And I just don't see enough people really acknowledging that it's really genuinely not even close between the two, right? Like, I can't imagine anybody honestly coming away thinking that Baldur's Gate 3 is ever going to take a W in this situation, even if it wins every single game award from every single gaming publication. Like, nobody cares, okay? Like, that's the thing, that's the grim reality we're in now, where, like, nobody really cares what the gaming public thinks about the games. People are naturally going to gravitate to the games that are better and look more interesting. And that's why Nintendo has remained so popular. That's why The Last of Us fell off the way it did. That's why PlayStation was not able to stay relevant with any of their franchises that they established in the 90s because the games were not interesting. They did not keep people's attention. And meanwhile, Nintendo is still pumping out the 2D Mario games that sell millions, right? They're still pumping out WarioWare games. They're still pumping out like Detective Pikachu. They're still making new Fire Emblem games. You know, Fire Emblem wasn't successful for a long time and they made it successful. Why? Because they're better creators than anyone else in the industry, right? We're gonna see what happened with Tears of the Kingdom happen with other Nintendo franchises. We are going to see a revolution in Pokemon. We are going to see more 3D Mario on the level of Odyssey and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. We are going to see like major Nintendo IPs make major strides in becoming bigger and better than their competition. And much like Tears of the Kingdom, we're going to see a lot of fighting of denial about the fact that these games are better, right? We kind of see this now with like the strategy game community. How many people are willing to admit that Fire Emblem is the most popular strategy RPG in the world, right? Whenever you start talking about this, people start screaming about Final Fantasy Tactics when you know, anybody knows that they haven't had a new game in like 20 years. You know, I think the last good one was the first one in the 90s, right? So like how exactly is Final Fantasy Tactics going to compete with new Fire Emblem games? Like it doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense at all. And the excuses that people throw out are becoming flimsier, they're becoming emptier, they come off as hollow because these guys don't have any conviction. They don't have any real faith in the products they're trying to defend. They don't have any real interest in games or any real interest in talking about good interesting titles with interesting mechanics and characters, right? All they want to do is downplay Nintendo for attention, for clicks, for money. We see this all the time in a variety of different ways. But what it all comes down to is that Nintendo is the best, but the industry is doing everything in its power to prevent people from realizing that it is true. Right? Tears of the Kingdom is one of the best games released this year, and nothing you do will ever prevent it from being seen that way by the general gaming public.